Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us. We know we'll continue to have folks join in, but this is our second session and it is all about federal accountability. We can go to the next slide just as sort of an introduction. My name is Lane Carr. I'm the administrator for the Office of Policy and Strategic Initiatives and the former director of accountability, serving as sort of a dual role for this year is accountability, joined by my colleague, Dr. Shirley Vargas, who serves as our school transformation officer and the administrator for the Office of School and District Support. Our objectives are pretty straightforward. We want to revisit the AQuest system of supports, which is going to sound familiar if you joined in on our early session. We might say things different or say things the same, and hopefully you see some of the overlap then and tie together in from our first session, because these designations that we're going to be talking about are an integral part of that system of support. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the key accountability changes and walk through from a very high level what we are talking about with accountability, sort of the theory of action, as well as the nitty-gritty. And certainly we'll get even further into the details and into the weeds at our first session tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., which is all about the business rules. And then we also want to just spend just a short amount of time talking about the long-term adjustments and what's going to be needed with our ESSA plan changes. I'm going to turn it over to Shirley to kick us off.
Yeah, so to get started, we're going to jump into the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is where the majority of our work is coming from related to federal accountability, and wanted to just provide a quick update around, some of the historical context related to this federal legislation. So what you see here, it actually stems from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, and it's been amended multiple times. Many of you probably on the screen know its former life as No Child Left Behind, that came really prescriptive and really, focused on ensuring that we met some proficiency benchmarks that maybe were seeming unrealistic and therefore had a lot of consequences if things weren't met. So this took a little different turn, really focus on equitable outcomes for all children, focus on equitable access to effective educators, and it also required every state to complete an ESSA state plan. And then we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. But we wanted to just let you all know, right? This came from 2015, and this is essentially the federal education law that state agencies must follow. So many of you probably also know, but just providing you some context related to what's actually included in the ESSA law. And what you see, there are 9 titles related to this specific law. And some of you may receive funds for all of them. Some of you may receive funds for a few, but essentially it really starts with the focus on improving academic achievement of economically disadvantaged students. Then talks about, the different titles related to effective educators and leaders, teaching students that speak a language other than English, excuse me, and so on and so forth. So just super high level in regards to that work.
Yeah, so I'll take this slide now. So it is fascinating to me, as Shirley was outlining sort of the titles in ESSA. The reality is that we get about 9% of our total state funding from the federal government. So a pretty small share in reality compared to state amounts through our TIOSA formula, and then the federal from the local property taxes as well. And yet it has a lot of say. The federal government provides these funds specifically for student groups, as Shirley was mentioning. So as we were, sorry, I'm just like sort of nerdy in that I just think it's really interesting how much influence the federal government and the U.S. Department of Ed have on our work. So as we then think about having to put together this plan, the drafting process began in 2016 in Nebraska. There was significant stakeholder feedback, including these sites that you see across the state. I'm going to share a couple of additional historic documents in the chat box. And for those that are joining virtually, these will be in our slides, and we will have those slides available after the session. There was a lot of feedback from our stakeholders during this time and have continued forward of this requirement or this need to blend state and federal accountability. So let's not run two parallel accountability systems, but let's try to bring some coherence to that. So that was abundantly clear in 2016. It's abundantly clear now to try to keep those things as tight as possible. Interestingly, it coincided with the State Board of Education putting together a strategic vision and direction. So it was actually perfect timing to incorporate and infuse and weave in some of the findings from our ESSA listening sessions into the strategic vision and direction, as well as vice versa. We first submitted our ESSA state plan, which is again on our ESSA webpage that I just put in the chat, in September of 2017, and then spent literally months in a back and forth process with the US Department of Ed to finally seek that approval in June of 2018. So what's in our ESSA plan? There are six sections that are found there. It's a pretty lengthy document that includes some required statutory things from the feds, including setting out long-term goals and saying the interim benchmarks to get us to those goals. Section 2 is all about how we consulted with stakeholders, as well as how we look at our own performance as the NDE and monitor districts as well. Section 3 details the academic assessments that we use, and no surprise here, but this is going to be one of the sections that most needs updating, especially with our NSCAS growth. Section 4 is the big one that we're going to be talking about today, which is all about accountability and supports for improving schools. Section 5 is effective educators. As Shirley said, ESSA puts a premium on ensuring that all students have access to high quality, effective instruction. And then Section 6 is sort of a catch-all. This is where information on Title II, Title III, for our English learners, Titles 4, 5, 6, everything is basically kind of caught then in the remaining Section 6 there as well. So if you need some light reading or heavy reading, I encourage you to check out our state plan. Again, knowing that so much has changed, including our assessment, our pandemic, significant turnover in both staff and districts and the NDE. But I did want to just highlight on this slide how we've delivered upon our ESSA plan, because there have been significant accomplishments and steps towards that. The first is in this designation of schools for improvement. So it first began in fall of 2018, keeping in mind, right, that our plan was approved in September and we put it into play, or I'm sorry, in June, and we put it into place then in December for these CSI schools. The following year, we identified schools for TSI and ATSI. And then we've also just added to our capacity. So the development of Shirley's office and Shirley's position as our school transformation officer, as well as Dr. Zainab Rita, who is doing our work as equity officer, as well as specific supports around the whole child. So we've added, we saw the need to build on NDE's internal capacity and work to deliver upon the promise of ESSA. We've seen the system of supports evolve too, and you'll see a slide here in a little bit where we talk about how we differentiate and intensify supports differently for specific schools. And then we've also had a significant amount of work on our focus on effective educators with the work of Dr. Kim Snyder in our office, the NTPPS, the Nebraska Teacher and Principal Performance Standards, it's a mouthful, which were developed during this time and as a result of ESSA, and then a focus on leadership, which came out in our surveys that we did during this time as well, and the development of the Nebraska Leadership and Learning Network. Shirley also always takes the slideshow because she wants to move me along when it's time. I could wax poetic on all of the accomplishments there. We also know we have a lot of work to do. So just to foreshadow a little bit of the end of our presentation, there have been significant changes in our state that have caused us to need to revise our ESSA plan. And so we are currently pursuing an ESSA plan amendment. We're in the initial stages of that. And you'll see the reasons here, many of which I've already mentioned, and the primary of which I would say is COVID-19, right? We know that things have changed. We know our priorities have changed, must change and be updated. And then we have to we have to codify that into our ESSA plan. So as we look to the future, then right now we're in this space where this is sort of a transition year, and we're going to talk a little bit about this transition year and what it means. But we also want to get to a place where we're more stable and where we codify this in our ESSA plan amendment. As I mentioned in the previous session, as we mentioned, we've been pursuing work with the Center for Assessment, a national nonprofit, nonpartisan leader in assessment and accountability systems. And they've provided us a set of recommendations that we're going to then vet with other groups to make sure that what we then pursue in this ESSA plan amendment is embodied and is bought into by our folks. So that's just a little bit of like the long term. We know we'll need an ESSA plan amendment, an amendment to our state plan, but we want to talk about now. And so I'm going to turn it to Shirley to just get us started as we start to think about the fall of this year and the federal accountability.
So if you've been with us since this morning or joined us at NDE Day, or have heard any presentation that we've ever done related to accountability, right? We always ground ourselves in the why we do the things that we do and why we need some of the things that we have in place. So why we need an accountability system. We've talked about this at length in the past. We just want to quickly recenter that. Not only do we have to, but we also get to, right? And the get to is the fun part. And it's a lot of the work that I do related to creating a framework for school improvement, ensuring that we expose and support schools and districts in closing achievement and opportunity gaps, that we ensure responsibility of taxpayer funds, and that we set a standard for all of our schools. And the way we do that is through our AQuest system, and we use accountability indicators to get to that, right? So Lane's going to talk about these really quickly while we go through this all the time, but why don't you just jump in, Lane, real quick?
You bet. Our previous session went a little bit more in depth, and certainly tomorrow during our business rules discussion, we will go very in depth with the actual calculations of this. But in general, our state and our federal accountability systems use a specific set of indicators, which are simply put a measure of student achievement or something that we believe will influence student achievement. And they give us this picture of a school's performance. So ESSA has some specific things that they require, some specific buckets of indicators that they require, and they're not different from the ones that we have. They include things like status, which is the percent proficient on English language, arts, and math. They include measures of growth, like progress, growth and non-proficiency reduction. States must also include graduation rate, and Nebraska includes its 7-year graduation rate. For the first time, ESSA requires some measure of progress towards English language proficiency. In the state of Nebraska, we use the ELPA 21, and we'll get more details on the resources around ELPA tomorrow. And then chronic absenteeism, which is when a student misses 10% of their time in membership. And once again, tomorrow we'll talk even more deeply about how we plan on using chronic absenteeism. This is just another way to see it, basically. So on the first row, you'll see the ESSA indicator. Those are the sort of high-level areas that they require: academic achievement, academic progress, English language proficiency, graduation rate, and then this like kind of catch-all for any other indicators that schools may want, states may want, which are school quality and student success indicators. I do want to point out that you'll see these lines through specific indicators. This table is directly from our ESSA plan. And because of the changes that we've made, which we'll talk about a little bit deeper in a moment, we're not using some of those indicators in federal accountability this year. So we wanted to just be transparent and show some of those changes here. I do want to talk about the meaningful differentiation, which is this slide. And so Shirley, I'll turn it to you.
Great. So really quickly, again, as a quick refresher, we classify schools every year, excellent, great, good, needs improvement, and then we designate schools based on those indicators you saw on the previous slide for targeted, additional, targeted, or comprehensive support and improvement, or priority schools. And then you see the numeric breakdown for each of these groups here. And TSI and ATSI are really focused on student group performance. Comprehensive and priority schools is more focused on whole school improvement efforts. And just to make a quick distinction again between continuous improvement and school improvement, every school in our state engages in continuous improvement practices where you're really looking at goals and objectives that you have as a school community, as a school district, that is grounded on ongoing, self-reflection, growth, adaptation, and it's really something that every school and district engages in. School improvement is really more focused on dramatic comprehensive interventions that are supported and at times could potentially be co-led with the school, with the NDE, that are focused on leadership, instructional transformation, culture, and educator and leader development, right? So it's really focused on ensuring work happening between the teacher, the student, and the content that they're learning is really tight and is really supporting students to meet and exceed grade level material. And the way that we've also taken a different approach to supporting our schools is by taking a tiered system or a tiered look at how we're supporting our schools. So we need to make sure we understand where schools are identified to receive that additional support in order for us to coordinate, intensify, and differentiate that support where needed. So you'll see in the graphic, every school receives a classification, but not every school receives a designation. And the further you go up in the triangle, the more intensified that support is. But it doesn't mean that that school or that support stays there, right? Over time, then those supports shift or that school no longer needs that. And then those adjustments are made. Just to break down really quickly, the CSI designation, these are some of the specifics around how a school might be identified, right? It's the lowest 5% of Title I schools. Any high school that has a graduation rate lower than 67%, or a TSI school, that's a school that has a student group that's been underperforming. If that school is identified for 3 years, then that school becomes a CSI school. In addition to support around engaging in a needs assessment and, action planning, there's also federal funds that are available to support this work. Specifically for TSI and ATSI work here, any public school that meets the N size, which our N size is 10 for the 10 racial and ethnic and 3 other categories of students that we have that I'll identify in a couple of slides. This is where this designation means, and this is really meant to be a district-led improvement effort where we can provide and do provide support to districts to support schools in that designation. And it's really about ensuring that the district is able to support the implementation and monitoring of those plans, with the little caveat being that if a school is identified as ATSI, there are certain parameters that must be met. It does not mean you create a new plan and submit the plan and we approve it at the NDE. It's more about how do you leverage existing plans to ensure that they meet these requirements and also get to the outcomes that you're seeking to achieve. And some of those requirements are that it's designed with multiple stakeholders, informed by all the accountability indicators that we've outlined a few slides ago. And then specifically for ATSI, that a resource allocation review has been completed to identify any resource inequities, the use of funds, the use of time, the use of people in order to meet the needs of that specific student group. To quickly just show you a visual representation of the distribution of our schools, you'll see that while there may be some concentration in some areas, this actually is something that is across our state. And we see the largest student group being students with disabilities, second largest students who are economically disadvantaged, and third, students who are English learners. It is possible that schools have been identified for multiple student groups. As we know, students live at intersections, right? They could be a student with a disability, be a student that's white, and be a student who is economically disadvantaged. But all in all, it's really about making sure that we take each individual student group as individual groups in order to understand the impact there. And these are the 10 groups that we have here: 7 racial and ethnic groups, as well as economic disadvantage, English learners, and students with disabilities. So I'm going to keep going from here. Okay, I'll pause.
Really quickly, there's a great question in the chat, which says, might be a business rule question. We will talk about it tomorrow, but I'll also take it now. If a school has class sizes smaller than 10 students, do we look over time to get to the 10 in that student group, or are they automatically out of the subgroup designation? They are automatically out of that specific student group designation is the quick answer there. For a lot of other AQuest related things, we do pool over time. For example, graduation rate. So small schools that have 4 or 5 students graduating, we pool, meaning we take the year before and sometimes even the year prior to that, 2 years before, pool it together to look at that graduation rate. We do not do it for this TSI and ATSI designation. It is specifically, are there 10 students in that student group during this year?
Okay, love it. And that's also a great question, because we're going to actually go through a few slides here where we go through a series of questions around how do we get to a designation and the steps that are involved. So you may have seen this image in the past that we've used to identify schools for a particular level of support. As you all know, AQuest does not rank schools. As such, we use a filter-like process to get to a set number of schools that we designate as CSI, ATSI, or ATSI. We also know this isn't the friendliest or most intuitive image. Therefore, I've blocked it out just for now, and we'll be updating these images, and you'll see in the subsequent slides what we're going towards. And if you have thoughts about the subsequent slides, please also let us know. So we're going to start with targeted and additional targeted support and improvement. And what we want to show you here is visually represent, these are all public schools. And there's a little caveat, right? These are all schools that have at least 10 students in each of the following student groups. So we essentially will do this 10 times if there are in fact 10 students or more in those groups. And the little circles are meant to represent schools. No, they're not 1,004 schools there, but in the grand scheme of things, these are all of the public schools here, right? And the first question that we have to ask ourselves, does this school serve at least 10 students in the given student group? Let's say, for example, we're starting with students with disabilities, okay? So if the answer is yes, some schools made it through, and some schools didn't. And then now we're asking ourselves, in this first stage, are the students in this student group meeting proficiency standards? And if these students are also English learners, are they making progress towards proficiency? If the answer is yes, we're going to move forward in a second. What I also want you to understand, and why I put this red marker here on the bottom, is that the comparison group is also important to consider. For TSI, we're seeing that the student group should be performing at or below the lowest quarter of Title I schools in either status and or progress towards English language proficiency. And that's what's going to determine whether or not they move to the next stage. Lane, at any point you see that I'm saying something incorrect, you just make a note and I can, thank you. Okay. So those schools, then we're seeing the pool get a little smaller now, right? So we have some schools that did make it through the filter. And what we now ask ourselves here is, are students in this group at least making progress towards growing, right? Are they growing towards that proficiency benchmark? And again, we're seeing the comparison group being the student group performing at or below the lowest quarter. Okay. Now we see getting even smaller, right? So now we're seeing, well, they made it through this. Let's ask ourselves this next set of questions, which is to what extent are the students in this group chronically absent? Prior to this school year, we would have asked ourselves around science, improvement and proficiency, as well as EBA, right? But those things are no longer in consideration for this academic year. So what we're doing is just focusing on that chronic absenteeism, and what we see here, if the answer is yes, those are then the schools that are identified for that specific designation of TSI. So I'm going to pause there and I'm going to turn it over to Lane. And then if there are questions that are coming up, because I can't see the chat, I'll let him take it.
You did fantastic, Shirley. I think the new filters hopefully help illustrate that a little bit better. We're going to actually go through that filtering process for each of our designations for chronic comprehensive support and improvement, additional targeted support and improvement, and then also for our targeted support and improvement. So we want to make sure people are feeling prepared for the fall, especially when it's been a while since we've done these designations, and especially since we're going to have a little bit of carryover from our last designations. We'll talk about that timeline in just a little bit. So we've said these before, but just again, we're required to redesignate schools. And we hope too that you'll use some of these talking points, in that this year is this transition year, a dimmer switch back on to accountability rather than just singularly flipping on accountability. We know that this isn't going to be normal. We have some data disruptions. We had 77,000 students that were chronically absent, which is 23% of our kids, right? We also know there were changes to our accountability system. All this to say we can't just do the same thing we did in our ESSA plan, or have written in our ESSA plan. And we know too, we admit as NDE that we need to get to a place that is predictable and stable for you all, so you know the target for you to really shoot towards. Put another way, different year requires different accountability. That's what this year will be. We need to reset expectations, re-baseline our data so that we can project forward once again where we want our kids, our specific student groups, our communities to be. And then this year will really give us a snapshot of which schools are serving the students that were most impacted by the pandemic. So where a lot of times we've looked over trend data, we're really focused in on, yes, trends over the last 2 years, but really the snapshot in data right now to tell us which students are struggling, which schools need additional support, and where we need to focus. So if we did not pursue flexibility this year, we would have been held to what was written into our ESSA plan. In about April, we began the process of getting feedback from stakeholders to think through what some of those decisions should be, including things like indicator changes, timelines, et cetera. And based on the input from district leaders like yourselves, we submitted what was called an addendum to the federal government, and it was approved in May. And since that time, this highlighted shows we've been really focused on business rules, which are in development, and we'll be able to talk through them in their draft form tomorrow. And then also starting this communication process at admin days today and tomorrow with these sessions, and then beyond, really focused on that. And then the fall implementation. So we're here, and I've gotten a couple of questions in the previous session also already today. In this one about the timeline and what that looks like. We have all of the data to make these designations and classifications. We are, for classification, specifically waiting on science, which is used in our state accountability, that excellent, great, good, and needs improvement. The nice thing is that with this addendum, we pulled out science for the year, and so we're able to get these designations. Our hope is early fall, meaning sometime in September and early October, we will have these data on the NEP Secure, ready for your consumption, thought processes, communication internally in an embargoed fashion. We're going to talk just a little bit about some of the key changes. And again, if you've been in any of our recent sessions, these shouldn't be a surprise to you. But there were some key changes to the indicators of our accountability system this year. The first is that we had in our system the evidence-based analysis, which was a self sort of diagnosis at a school and district level. It was a survey of sorts that included evidence. It was a lengthy process, and it added a significant amount of time to our accountability system. Based on stakeholder feedback, and because we haven't done it for the past 3 years at this point, or 2 years, I guess, we removed the EBA using these addenda process. We also pulled out improvement as an indicator. Improvement was a 3-year sort of trend line that we were able to draw. And based on feedback, once again, improvement was seen as sort of redundant. And also, we don't have 3 years of data. We have 2 years of data. And so kind of drawing a line may not be the same as using growth, which is what we're really doubling down on. Non-proficiency, which is an indicator that we use in both elementary and middle schools, as well as the only measure of progress in high school, is normally a 3-year trend line where we want to see that going down. We want to see non-proficient scores go down, right? The number and percent of non-proficient students go down. Usually it's 3 years because we only have 2 data points. We will be using a 2-year trend as well. Significant feedback about science. There's a new science assessment in grades 5 and 8. And also the delay, the state board just approved the cut scores on Friday, and that delay would have pushed us further out into the fall. And so we removed science and science improvement from federal accountability only. It's a state requirement that will be in our state classifications. And then the last big change to our indicators was around chronic absenteeism. And so normally we set a baseline using 3 years of data, set out a goal for every school and every student group, and then look at the reduction towards that goal. But because we don't have, and we've had significant variance in chronic absenteeism over the time, we didn't see the sense or the ability, to be honest, to include that goal and that baseline as our system. So harken back to when we're talking about a snapshot in time, focusing in on the student groups in the schools that were most impacted, chronic absenteeism this year will be an absolute measure, meaning that we'll look at what was the school's chronic absence like last year, and the 21-22 data, and those that had significant chronic absence, we'll show you in a minute how that fits into the filter. Those will be the schools that, in addition to the other indicators, were identified for support. Shirley, I may have you take the summary of changes here in our cohorts, and the next slide after that, which is our graphic.
You got it. So what are the actual changes that will impact CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools? So what you see is that we're going to remain with the filter, with the updated version of it at least, right? And also adjusting the different pieces, like the example that I gave where, and like Lane mentioned, in one of the filters, it included science, EBA, right? Those things are not taken into account. So we have to make those adjustments in that filter. The second piece, and this is more of a clarification, but we want to make sure that we continue to uplift this. The TSI designation occurs annually. So a school would have been identified in 2019. It might be that school will exit this fall, right? So, and we will re-identify new schools this year for TSI, and they may exit the following year. So that happens every year, but there's a movement of in and out with TSI because there is no next step if a school doesn't exit a TSI designation, right? Maybe internally it might be like, well, we need to do something differently. We keep getting identified or haven't exited as a TSI school, but we'll talk about a little bit more specifically here in a moment with the timeline around what that means for the other designations. And then lastly, the 2 sets of changes for cohort, what we're calling cohort 1, which is the original ATSI and CSI cohorts, and then cohort 2, which maybe we should change pandemic to transition CSI and ATSI or something a little bit differently, but we're still working through that nomenclature here. That's specifically for schools that are identified this fall, like Lane mentioned about that timeline. So really quickly, I know you've seen this graphic, some of you, what you see here is in the first 3 rows are specifically our CSI schools, and then the subsequent 3 rows are ATSI school. I'll draw your attention to the middle of the table, which you see 22, 23 as the transition year. While we have it listed to 26, 27, we did have to think forward around the implications of the decisions of this year, right? And what it would have for subsequent years. So currently, I currently identified CSI schools will have the opportunity to exit this fall once we run these classifications, and we'll talk about that exit criteria in the next slide. But we'll also have new CSI schools that will be identified, approximately 27 schools. For ATSI, you see schools, we have currently 116. Those schools will remain identified as ATSI and will have the opportunity to exit next school year, but we will identify new ATSI schools this year. Schools that are identified this year will have an opportunity to exit at any point throughout their designation period. So they're not locked in, for example, into a 3-year or 4-year cycle. So if I enter a designation this year as TSI, as ATSI or CSI, I am eligible to exit next school year. That is a big shift, and why the looking forward and like looking ahead to long-term adjustments is important, because we want to make sure that our leaders and educators understand that you have an opportunity to exit, whereas the original designations, like you see from 2018, 2019, those were all kept together, right? They didn't have an opportunity to exit. So it's a big shift. We want to make sure that we underscore that. Well, I'll share on our next slide here, and thanks, Lane, for putting that timeline so you all can at least look at the document as well and think and see our thinking around that. Specifically around the exit criteria. We've had to make some adjustments to the exit criteria, which is why the addendum was important. If not, we'd have to hold the same, we'd have to hold the requirements that were written into our ESSA plan as the way of executing this work. So schools identified in 2018, like I mentioned, will be eligible to exit this year. The adjustment for the exit criteria is that the school can no longer be identified as CSI. It cannot be in the lowest 10% of Title I schools. Originally, it was the lowest quarter of Title I schools. So we made that distinction. And it's not about lowering the bar, but it's more around just resetting expectations and making sure that we're providing schools an opportunity to show that they were able to exit, and then have made significant progress across all indicators. So I'll leave that to Lane to describe what that might mean. For high schools specifically, we did have a couple of schools that were identified specifically around graduation rate, but for high schools that were identified as CSI, their graduation rate must be above 67% and have 2 consecutive years of graduation improvement. So we're trying to be really intentional about supporting schools and exiting, but also ensuring that we're not just exiting schools that will bounce right back into that designation in the following school year. And then for schools that do not exit, our CSI schools that do not exit, their more vigorous option will be creating a new plan, revising their current plan, or engaging in an alternative administrative structure. But that is not led by the NDE, that is led by their school and district office. So we are not necessarily saying that schools have to, fire their principal or anything like that. I just want to make that really clear around that component. Lane, it looked like you had something to say before. No? Okay. So really quickly, just to show you the filter here, we may need to adjust this. Is that correct? No, it's great. Okay. So we have the filter here around the lowest quarter of Title I schools, and then schools going through that filter process here. And then that's for elementary and middle schools. And then here we have the same filter for high schools. And I'll turn it over to Lane.
You bet, thanks. So there is a quick distinction between the elementary and middle and the high school level. And that is that you'll see that the progress towards English language proficiency status And now the growth measure that we have in high schools, which is non-proficiency, is all in stage 1. So when Shirley was doing that kind of animated thing around the questions, we ask ourselves, is this high school in the lowest quarter of status? Yes, then we move it over. No, well, are they in the lowest quarter of English language proficiency as compared to Title I? Yes, then we move them over. No, then they stay the same. Are they the lowest quarter in non-proficiency? Yes, then we move them over into the next stage. And stage 2, which is different for high schools, includes graduation rate. And you'll see that these the changes occur not only in the indicators that are included in this stage, but also that comparison group that I think is really important to note here. I do want to point out too on the high school level that this is all Title I high schools. So there aren't very many Title I high schools, which is why at the end of our designation, those schools that are identified for support, we have very few high schools that are identified through this filtering process. As Shirley mentioned, in the high school level, we also look at all high schools. They don't have to be Title I high schools, and they're automatically identified for CSI if they have a graduation rate below 67%. So that's our comprehensive support and improvement. Again, looking at overall how are schools performing across all of these specific indicators. And we can always come back to these if you have any questions specifically, but Shirley's already mentioned this. So this cohort 2, those that are identified this fall, we'll have those identifications soon, as Shirley mentioned, but just to reiterate, normally it's a 3-year cohort. This year, it's going to be a 4-year cohort through 2026, but as Shirley has mentioned, these schools can exit at any time. We'll need to add that into our ESSA plan. And as Shirley mentioned, we're also adjusting the exit criteria, basically the questions that are asked to see if a school has been eligible for exit or is able to exit. I can kick us off here, Shirley, on this ATSI section and talk just a little bit about the changes for cohort 1, those that are already identified. So unlike our cohort 1 for comprehensive support and improvement, our ATSI schools that are currently ATSI will become eligible for exit in the fall of 2023, so next year, okay? We mentioned in a previous session, but these schools are going to be a real focus for us because of this second bullet, which is that schools that do ATSI schools that do not exit next year in 2023 become CSI schools. They roll up is sort of the term that is used in the accountability world. So we're really focused on getting those districts the supports they need right now so that as our students start to transition through this year, we can see those schools exiting. Similarly to adjusting our exit criteria for this next year in 2023, we have listed these items. So first is sufficient growth for this student group. And we've purposefully kept that vague so that we can define it in our business rules, which we will talk about tomorrow. And I'll actually get some input on that tomorrow as well. Originally, we had that a district could not, or a school would exit ATSI if they were no longer identified for 2 consecutive years. And the thought behind that was we don't want schools to pop in and out of status, meaning that they just happen to beat out one of the other schools and the next year they're identified again and this year they're not, right? We don't want that sort of bouncing back and forth because that's not the sustained improvement that is ultimately our goal, right? We also know that it's different, a different year. So we've crossed out, we struck the 2 consecutive years, and next year, when we look at the exit criteria for ATSI, if you're not an ATSI school, you're not an ATSI school. And as long as you've also made sufficient progress, et cetera. So as we look then at the elementary and middle school example of this, once again, Shirley kind of gave this example here. You will see that the comparison group is really important here. It's the 5% of Title I schools, the lowest 5% of Title I schools. So ATSI, one of the ways that we describe it and that it's described nationally is that if a student group were a school by themselves, so if they were the only students in that school, they would be a CSI school. They would be performing at or below the lowest 5% of Title I schools. So again, we run this process, we run this filter for each of our 7 racial and ethnic groups and identify a school, the schools for specific additional targeted support for that student group. Then we run them through with the economically disadvantaged students, students with disabilities, and English learners, and ultimately have 10 sets of schools that are identified for ATSI. Slightly different on the next slide for high schools. And that's, again, just including the graduation rate. And I see that we have a slight error on this, and that stage 2 should actually say graduation rate. So that's my fault on that. We'll make that change there. So stage 2 is that graduation rate for high schools. And then Shirley, I'll turn it to you to talk about TSI for these filters. Slightly different.
Sure. If you recall the example we provided, I don't know, 20 slides ago, you'll see that this is the TSI filter specifically for elementary and middle schools, again, focusing on the comparison group. And here, instead of it being the lowest 5%, it's the lowest quarter of Title I schools. And you'll see that broken up here per the stage, the different stages. And then this is the TSI group for high school. I also see we have that. We just copied the same one over, but it's fine. Nothing here is not uneditable. So we'll make those changes here. So we just quickly to summarize again, right? These things, the more we say it, I think the more we just continue to familiarize, I mean, us, all of us on the screen, and those who will be joining virtually later and others who are not here with us, right? The changes and the impacts of those changes, right? So specifically for the second cohort of ATSI schools, or those that are identified now in the fall, those schools would normally be in a 3-year cohort, but they'll in fact be in a 4-year cohort, but they'll be able to exit at any point throughout those 4 years. However, if they don't exit, they become a CSI school in 2026. So there's a clear focus on ensuring the 116 schools that are identified already that are remaining this year. There's a focus on those schools to make sure they have the supports that they need and that their districts have the support that they need to support those schools. And then there's also a focus on schools that are identified this year related to CSI and ATSI, ensuring that they understand that their eligibility to exit is throughout the 4 years, and that those supports that they might need will be made available to them upon that designation. So that is a lot of information. Some of it may have sounded repetitive. Some of it may have been brand new. Maybe you're left with some questions or wonderings. I'll preemptively show that, today's sessions are done, but we do have 2 sessions tomorrow at 9 a.m., which really focuses on some of those business rules. And we'll get into the comparison group, and we get into, some of the decision points that are made around cut points, or what makes a distinction between moving from a stage 1 to a stage 2. Also, where does the information live once you've figured all this stuff out, right? And then the 11 o'clock session is then, what is this all for? Like, so to what end are we going through all this, right? How are we using our AQuest data in tandem with other sources of data to inform our improvement efforts, right? So we're going to just dig into some of the resources we have, provide some examples, and hopefully you all walk away with some resources you can use right away and a better understanding or deeper understanding around AQuest accountability and all things related to that. I'll turn it over to Lane really quickly.
No, that's spot on. We're looking forward to, for those who are really interested in the depths, going into that tomorrow. And then the other folks who are focused more on the then what and what now, also tomorrow. Let's take just a little time. We have plenty of time left in our session. Want to just hear from questions from the field. And if you would please put those in the chat, and then we'll read those out. So we'll just allow some opportunity for feedback or questions. Okay, first question. Is there a thought to the replacement mechanism now that EBA possible point is gone? How is NDE communicating this? So for the federal designation, that was always really tricky because basically what you said at the school level was your EBA score was applied to every student group. So the removal of that really doesn't impact the federal accountability in the same way that it does with the classifications and designations. We did have this question from our assessment and accountability advisory, or kind of pose this question. I think it's about two things. One is about kind of the communication around the new normal, as the commissioner has spoken about, and what it really looks like, as well as this idea of rebaselining. The other thing I will say is that we are currently talking about sort of the distribution, the recommended distribution of schools that we want to see in that excellent, great, good, and needs improvement. And so certainly welcome feedback on what that distribution should be, and then also around the communication. Shirley, I don't know if you have anything to add to that specific question. Okay, the second one is, there's not a release date, but do you know when that decision will be made around the release specifically? Yeah, so we'll be communicating that with DACs and superintendents as soon as we know it. We hate to put out a date because oftentimes this is something we do like, which is that we get a lot of feedback, or we find that there are seemingly small errors in either a calculation or something. That doesn't happen often, but it sometimes does, that will affect either a student group calculation or a larger classification and redesignation changes. If you all recall, from the fall of 2019, we had two communications, basically, one initially and a second when it was final. And we're really trying to reduce that communication because it led to a lot of miscommunication, misunderstanding, and other issues. All of this to say, we're shooting for a mid-September release of the NEP Secure, where we would email DACs, superintendents, and sometimes DACs and the AQuest folks are slightly different. So we'll also share out with them that the NEP Secure has the most updated information for these designations and classifications. So mid-September, and then we'll work with districts on communication, on understanding before we release that to the public later. So give plenty of time. I don't think I really answered the question about when a decision will be made, other than to tell you we have all of the data and we really think that we can get moving on this now. We're also making changes and updates to the NEP Secure, which is taking some time. There's another question here about communicating to current ATSIs. Shirley, would you take that one?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question because I'm trying to determine, as we've been planning these sessions, what would be most beneficial if it's by ESU versus trying to get all 116 schools to come together. We have in the past, when we've communicated to our schools that they should be relying upon or reaching out to or communicating, connecting with their ESU for that support. So I think I may err on the side of connecting with ESUs to make sure that they understand what are the schools in their district that are ATSI that should also be on their radar for this school year, as well as districts specifically, so that they also know that. So the answer is I am planning on it. And it's just a matter of finding the right entry point there. And maybe there's no wrong entry point, because the more you can communicate this, the better. So more to come.
I also just want to add that this has not been top of mind for everybody. And there have been some turnover. There's been a lot of turnover in superintendents, in district staff, et cetera. So we want to make sure that you're just even aware if there's a designation at your school. So I'm going to share my screen very quickly and just show you two places where you can find that. The first is the Nebraska Education Profile, or both are actually on the Nebraska Education Profile. In our data downloads section, so NEP, data downloads, and then if you scroll down to 2018 and 19, there's a Excel sheet that has the AQuest classifications, and then I'll share what that looks like very quickly. Once you open that up, this is for all of our schools, and you'll see it by district, by school, and then specifically if they are a TSI or ATSI, and for which student group. So that's in our data downloads section. And then I'll also show you sort of the public facing look of that, which is also on our NEP. You'll search any district. We'll do the one that I was just looking at in Hastings. And then in the AQuest classification, you'll see these two badges here, where it talks about TSI, and then it says the student groups as well as ATSI and the student groups for that specific school as well. So it's two ways to see the same information.
Are there any other questions or comments related to today's session, or in general?
So this is Sarah. I just going back to my question, and then you guys kind of started talking about public release. And I guess my question would be, so I'm the first to say, yay, no more EBAs. However, without a replacement opportunity, I'm wondering if NDE has already created some talking points about the fact that then that totally changes some classifications. So I mean, hypothetically, if a district had 60 schools and 16 of them got the EBA bump, it would not be out of the realm of possibility that a school could actually stay the same with their test scores, or even go up a little bit, but go down in their original designation because they don't have that opportunity anymore. So I'm just trying to see if you guys have some talking points for us as those come out, that your neighborhood school didn't get worse by an entire point. You know what I'm saying? I'm just wondering about those talking points statewide.
Yeah, we don't have those created yet, Sarah, as such. We're kind of taking more of a like philosophical, like, why are we here? What is kind of going on? But that's something that I've made note of that we can talk through. That's a good one. And we might ask you, how to incorporate that in a way that, I will say, our public didn't really understand the EBA first, right? Because we released data and said, check back soon because the school's undergoing a process, right? So I think it is going to be clearer, but that isn't what you're talking about. I get the point of like, some schools are going to change significantly or have a potential to be one or two, classifications different. So I've made note of it, and that can be included in our talking points.
Thanks, Lane. And I didn't want you to think that I was saying to bring back the EBA. I just meant that any school who got the bump statewide, they may have a surprise when they don't have that anymore.
Totally. Yep, that it makes total sense. Surely there's a question in here. Will the comprehensive needs assessment tool be required for CSI? What about TSI and ATSI?
The comprehensive needs assessment will be required for all CSI schools. For TSI and ATSI, I am suggesting that schools use the CNA, whether it's manually selecting a tenant or engaging with the entire tool. We are not attempting to mandate a resource to every school, but we do know that extensive Nebraska perspective and voice was included in the revision of the CNA, and it is in fact meant to be comprehensive in that nature. And through our partnership with NEMTSS, there is hope in the near future that we have one needs assessment. So the more that schools, districts, ESUs familiarize themselves with the needs assessment, I would say the better. But CSI schools will be required. ATSI and TSI schools will be strongly encouraged to use the needs assessment or some other tool to help them identify needs.
Fantastic. Great questions, you all. Well, we've really appreciated the time with you today to talk real specifically about federal designations, federal accountability just in general. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., we will be talking about business rules. It'll be very technical in nature, but also helpful. We'll show some of those data sources. And then at 11 o'clock tomorrow, as Shirley mentioned, we're transitioning then to what now? Using AQuest and other data sources for improvement efforts. As always, reach out to Shirley or me if you have any questions. And with that, we will sign off. Thank you so much.